Hi, everyone. My name is Michael with WX Capital. Welcome back to our Demystifying Biotech series. Today, we'd like to talk to you about clinical trials. So, a lot of you may have heard all sorts of different terminology around phase 1 through 3 clinical trials, but may not exactly understand how all of this relates to making investment decisions in the biotech space. So that's going to be our topic for today. Now, everyone probably knows that there are certain inflection points for stocks that can drastically impact their valuation. For most stocks, that is earnings calls. So when a company is announcing how well they're doing, what do their profits look like, what do their revenues look like, how much debt do they have? That can oftentimes significantly drive greater or have a negative impact on valuation of a company. In biotech, you also have earnings calls, and they are important for stock price. But biotech is pretty unique in the sense that many of its inflection points are unique to that space. The key inflection points here are the phase 1 through 3 clinical trial readouts, as well as the PDUFA dates. Now, the PDUFA date is when the FDA determines whether a drug is going to be approved for marketing or not. We're not really going to get into that in this video, but please keep an eye out for our upcoming video on PDUFA dates, what they mean, and how to interpret those results. Instead, we're going to focus our attention today on the phase 1 through 3 clinical trials, and they differ pretty extensively from something like a PDUFA date, because with PDUFA dates, that is a time that is essentially set in stone by the FDA. There's an announcement about when the PDUFA date is going to occur, and it usually happens around that general time. But with the clinical trial readouts, they can come at somewhat random times and can also be pretty difficult to understand how they're going to impact a company's valuation. So with that, let's jump in. Now, before we get onto phase 1 through 3 trials, we first need to talk about the preclinical phase. Most people have probably heard the term lab rat or understand that scientists are doing experiments with animals. That's because in order to enter clinical trials in humans, a drug must be tested on animals first. That animal is most commonly a mouse, but there are other quote-unquote model organisms that can be used, things like rats, pigs, dogs, and monkeys. This is usually just to make sure, one, that a drug is actually working. Now, what happens in the preclinical phase is animals are typically given the disease, oftentimes through genetic engineering, and then the drug is administered to check for things like efficacy and safety. Based on those results, the FDA will determine whether a drug can move into human trials or not. In terms of how this impacts a company's valuation, really not that much, just because oftentimes what happens in an animal can't necessarily be directly translated into a human. But what it does do is it sets the stage for those phase 1 trials. Now, phase 1 trials, they're first in human, and they can be either in healthy volunteers or in patients. Usually if it's in patients, it's because it's a rare disease, for example, or it's a disease with high unmet need, something like pancreatic cancer. So the main focus of phase 1 trials is really around safety. That's why healthy volunteers can be enrolled, because it's oftentimes just trying to figure out, is this drug toxic or not? And at what dose or what level can it be administered before toxicity starts kicking in? Now, if patients are enrolled, if patients with the disease are being tested on, then oftentimes efficacy will be examined as well. So going back to the example of pancreatic cancer, there will usually be an endpoint called response rate that is also included. And this is just to get a sense of how many of these patients are actually seeing some reaction in their cancer when they receive the drug. So how do phase 1 trial results actually impact a company's valuation? Well, it depends. If there are healthy volunteers, usually there's not much upside there, because all that's really happening is figuring out whether the drug is toxic or not. So if it's toxic, then that could negatively impact the overall projections for valuation. However, if it's positive and there are no toxicity effects, then it usually just means status quo is on track. So not all that much upside in that regard, but if it's tested in patients, and if it's a really hard to treat disease like pancreatic cancer, where many patients just have no treatment whatsoever, then seeing any sort of response rate can actually be pretty impactful for investors and can get investors pretty excited about a new drug. But overall, phase 1 trials are pretty easy to get past, so the impact is generally pretty limited. All right, now thinking about phase 2 trials. So phase 2 trials basically always have patients. And this is usually a mix of safety and efficacy endpoints. And it's really the first glimpse that a lot of companies have in terms of how is their drug working in patients. Now, in contrast to phase 3 trials, which we'll talk about shortly, phase 2 trials can use what's called a single-arm trial design. What that means is that there's no comparator that's actually required in this case. So patients can just receive the drug, and then the efficacy and safety endpoints of the drug can be measured, and that can be enough to get onto phase 3 studies. Now, contrary to popular belief, sometimes a phase 3 trial is not actually needed. For diseases that have really high unmet need, or for orphan diseases in which there's no real treatment, oftentimes the FDA will use phase 2 data in order to approve a drug, and then will ask for phase 3 follow-up data as the drug is being launched. This is oftentimes through various designations that can be granted by the FDA, so something like a breakthrough therapy designation. We're not going to talk too much about that here, but keep an eye out for our upcoming video about the various designation statuses that the FDA can bestow on new drugs. And this is actually a increasing phenomenon. So in 2018, 1 out of 8 drugs did not have a phase 3 trial data before they were approved by the FDA. So given all of this, what exactly does that mean for a stock's valuation, and how should you interpret phase 2 results? Well, it can actually have a pretty big impact, especially because this is really the first chance we get at seeing how efficacious this drug is in patients. Also, that's because phase 2 trials are the most difficult barrier to get past. So only 30% of drugs in phase 2 will actually make it onto phase 3. So having positive results here is clearing a major hurdle in that quest to gain FDA approval. All right, now thinking about phase 3 trials. These are the big ones. These are a huge undertaking. They're the definitive trials that are going to influence whether the FDA grants approval or not. Phase 3 trials always have efficacy as a primary endpoint, and they're typically enrolling quite a few different patients. It depends on the disease, of course, but oftentimes these trials will have hundreds, if not thousands of patients, and they'll be conducted across dozens of different trial sites. So we mentioned that phase 2 trial can use this single-arm trial design. In the case of phase 3, it requires a comparator of some kind. Oftentimes it will have multiple arms, so oftentimes trials might have 3-4 different arms. It's usually compared to what's called the standard of care, and that means what are patients getting currently? So let's take pancreatic cancer, for example. If the standard of care is to give patients chemotherapy, then a new drug needs to demonstrate that it's at least as good, if not better, than that standard of care in order to be used. Otherwise, the doctor might say, well, why would I use a drug that's not as efficacious versus what I have in terms of my standard of care? Now, there are different ways to differentiate outside of just efficacy. So, for example, if a drug is safer, then that might drive utilization. But ultimately, in the minds of most physicians, they're most caring about efficacy, and they're willing to sacrifice some level of safety if it means better efficacy. Now, as mentioned, these are pretty big undertakings. Phase 3 trials can cost companies millions of dollars. And how much it costs depends on a variety of different factors. The 2 biggest factors being how many patients are enrolled and how long is the trial. So for something like how long the trial is, or what's called trial duration, that depends on the disease and it depends on the endpoints that one is looking at. So for example, if you're looking at overall survival, And one disease, patients tend to survive 6 months, and for another disease, patients survive 10 years, then to see any difference in overall survival, you would have to stretch that trial out to over 10 years in order to parse out any improvements for a novel therapy. Now, thinking about how this impacts a company's valuation, obviously it's huge. This is arguably the single biggest driver of a company's stock price. Now, how big of a driver it is depends on the size of the company. So there are smaller companies that might have one or a few drugs in their pipeline. Their valuation is almost entirely based on what that phase 3 trial result is going to be. There are other companies, so for example, Pfizer or Johnson & Johnson, Gilead, these sort of large cap companies that have many different drugs in their portfolio. So just one drug's phase 3 trial success is not likely to have as big of an impact, but will still have an impact nonetheless. We also want to offer a word of caution here, which is don't overinterpret phase 2 results and assume that that means there's going to be phase 3 success. There have been many different examples in which a drug performed really well in phase 2, but then puttered out in phase 3. And that can be for a variety of different reasons. So for example, perhaps phase 2 was only done at select few trial sites, whereas now a phase 3 trial is done at many trial sites. It can also have to do with having a comparator arm. So maybe it shows efficacy in phase 2, but then when it's stacked up against standard of care, that efficacy isn't enough to edge out what's currently on the market. So as mentioned, phase 3 trial results huge for company valuation, but that's not the end of the story. Once a drug succeeds in phase 3 trials, that is when the FDA will assign a PDUFA date. Now, the PDUFA date is when the FDA will make their ultimate decision about whether a drug is approved or not. And sometimes it can seem like a drug is going to get approved based on the data that they've provided, but then the FDA will actually hand out a rejection letter. This is exactly what we saw last week with BioMarin, shocked a lot of people, and so it does happen. So would also just mention that just because a drug has succeeded in phase 3 trials, the definition of success is somewhat open to interpretation. Additionally, there are other reasons why a drug might not get approved, even if it's shown to be more efficacious than the standard of care. Please keep an eye out for our upcoming PDUFA date video for more information on that topic. All right, well, that's all we got on our end for phase 1 through 3 trials and how those results impact investing decisions. But we'd love to hear from you all. What do you think about phase 1 through 3 trials? What other information is important to keep in mind when interpreting these results? Please leave us a comment below. If you like the content of this video, as well as our Demystifying Biotech series, please give us a like, share, and subscribe. And stay tuned for more information around how to make smart investing decisions here at WX Capital. Thanks, and see you next time.
If you guys liked our video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Also, check out our website at www.wx.capital. We have a great subscription service that allows you to get real-time trades as well as market commentary, so you know exactly what's going on with stocks and you know exactly what we're trading and what the next hot stock pick is. See you guys around.